Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. So we are going to keep on going down the road. Well, actually, I suppose we've reached the end of this road of many roads within this conversation of motivational psychology. But insofar as covering each of the three basic psychological needs, I've already had a video up or an audio up of talking about autonomy support 101, and then talking about competence support 101. And now I want to discuss the basics of offering relatedness support 101. Okay, so I think there's a bit of a broader conversation here, I think, because when we're talking about relatedness, what we're really trying to get at is, and consider as well the context of self-determination theory having what it coins as people having as self-determination theory coins as basic psychological needs. Now, we are social creatures, human evolution. We achieved what we achieved through language, through coordinated activity, through collaboration with one another. There's a reason why people who are isolated from other people, why they just don't experience great cognitive, affective, and behavioural outcomes. That the actual feeling of belonging and connection to other humans is paramount to the human condition. And sport, coaching of sport, these are all microcosms of society, of our own reality. So we just cannot remove the social element of coaching, the need to ensure that there are connections, social connections within coaching. Therefore, now you might go, well, is that not common sense? And it's strange because it's really not a secret. Everyone knows how important the coach-athlete relationship is. I mean, and by the way, I'm going to explain relatedness as a means of achieving a better coach-athlete relationship through the way that we look at things in an SDE, self-determination theory lens. But there's amazing work already out there of different ways of conceptualizing of relatedness and social connections and how we can create good, strong relationship via duets, coach-athlete relationship theory, looking at the 4 C's. Colin Cronin, who looks at caring coaching, or building upon sort of Nodding's sort of ethical model of care. These are just such amazing ways of looking at relatedness support within coaching as well. I'm just using my own language to get across some points in this specific conversation, but I just would just implore people to go and look at that sort of stuff. But the reason I mention it is that even though there's so much information out there around the need to have a caring relationship, I think it's very, and this is a criticism in some respects of coach education, not insofar as what it's putting in, because it offers, the traditional coach ed course offers a lot of content. It offers a lot of like how to do things, technical skills, tactical skills, which look, we're coaching athletes to be better in a sport. That is ultimately what, at least insofar as if we look at coaching through a really goal-directed sort of prism, that is what coaching is about getting athletes better at their sport. So we need to have that information. But it's funny that sometimes what's left out of the equation is actually the most fundamental, most easily obtained, and I say that somewhat with some naivety, it's not easily obtained, but at least insofar as what you have to do, one of the most simplest elements of coaching is just being a good person and looking after other people. And actually, I think even as coaches are trying to develop their own competence, what low-hanging fruit is that there's more to coaching than being a caring person, but being a caring person is a big part of it, being a good coach. That was something I think Colin Cronin introduced me to, that sort of metaphor, and it stuck with me. And I think that's what relatedness is getting at. Okay, so and it's not just, and actually I think the development of self-determination theory is a macro theory of motivation and human behaviour. The fact that there's actually 6 mini theories within self-determination theory. There used to only be 5. Only, I know it might say only 5. There used to be, in sort of in order of its development as a framework, and how it's probably listened to some degree of how people have experienced it and what it needs to do next. It started out as sort of like cognitive evaluation theory, looks more strictly at, intrinsic motivation and versus external controls, to then sort of organismic integration theory, where we looked at sort of like how do people internalize or not the various forms of extrinsic motivation, from more self-determined forms to less self-determined forms, to looking at goals content theory insofar as the goals that people set for themselves, but not just within a specific activity, but also sort of wider life, how that has consequences and implications for psychological needs and different motivational outcomes that can be attached to those things. To then basic psychological needs theory, looking at actually, the crux of it, what do people need and require, and that's around autonomy and competence support and relatedness support. To then it actually get brought in most recently relationships motivation theory. Now, that is a wee bit, and sorry, I've also forgot causality orientation theory as well, which is sort of like what are the differences in how people's tendency to orientate towards certain environments in terms of like, we might call this sort of like the locus of control, or that sort of the autonomy orientation is where people act out of interest and, in the valuing of what is occurring versus are we focusing more on rewards and what we can gain from activity and all those sorts of things, and is that pulling us towards different environments and stuff like that. So, but what I'm basically saying is we for a long time, while we recognise from the get-go, self-determination theory recognised from the get-go that relatedness is so key, there was quite a heavy conversation around just keep being more autonomy supportive, because by extension of being autonomy supportive, because it's so involving but not restrictive, but by extension of that involvement, that interpersonal involvement, you're satisfying relatedness. So there's a lot of good things that can come out of just being autonomy supportive for relatedness, which is fine. But we have to then remember, in the context of motivation in an athletic environment and coaching, the role that relatedness support actually can play in helping people internalise the reasons for being there. An athlete, for instance, that feels a better sense of belonging, that actually is going to help them push towards also trying to get better at the sport, because they, in some respects, feel they belong in an environment if they're good at it, which is about competence for, it's relatedness helping towards competence in the sense of competence. And then also when an athlete feels that they belong in an environment, they also trust the environment, which empowers them and encourages them to actually take ownership of their development inside that space as well. So relatedness unlocks autonomy. So they coaches out there that are trying to be, us coaches that are trying to be more autonomy supportive, have you considered, I keep giving the athlete opportunities for initiative taking and all these sorts of things, but they aren't actually taking it up. Why? Is it maybe to do with the fact that how you're actually dealing with them socially isn't sending the signals to them that they can trust the environment enough to start to take ownership of it with you? So these things are all connected. And even the reasons why people take part in sport, because it's not always because we just intrinsically love it. Sometimes it's actually because involvement in the sport brings us closer to people we want to have a relationship with. How many times do you talk to athletes sometimes and they actually, one of the reasons for why they took part in sport was because, it was a great day, it was a great way to spend time with my dad, it was a great way to spend time with my mum. Or, if it's not the sole reason, a big reason for why they stay is, well, I've developed such close bonds with the people in the activity itself. That doesn't just occur in social, recreational sport. Also, it's part of working for a team, even in senior sport, even within performance-focused environments. The sense of relatedness with your teammates encourages you towards team goals, these sorts of things. So, helps with all those sorts of, even where you want to take an athlete, if it's not where they're currently at, relatedness is a great way for keeping their attention, capturing their attention, and start to nurture the reasons for why they're there towards the more adaptive, more self-determined, more involved, interpersonally involved, more internalized, rather, reasons for being there. So it's so key. Now, yes, there are some activities that an athlete or a person can do in isolation and be happy enough in doing it, and they still maybe feel that they're getting better at it, their competence is satisfied, and they also feel in control of it, great, and they can still experience great outcomes. But by and large, if they also are doing it with people and they develop that social relationship with them, where not they recognise it right now, they would probably experience better outcomes than not, or actually they will, not even just probably, they will. So this is just in terms of just to offer a bit of context about why we really need to care about relatedness. I just wanted to get into that. Now, how can we actually be more relatedness supportive as a coach? Now, it's a bit about how you appear and also a little bit what you say and what you do. So let's cover how do you actually appear, because the first point that we can look at here is a warm communication style. Because, think about it, oftentimes it's not the message that you say. The message that you say does matter, but often how you say it can communicate a lot, because people read body language, they read expressions, they read the tone of voice. I could say a negative message or a more critical message, but if the tone of my voice is that was really bad, but we need to do better, but look, we can do this. It's not just the encouraging of the message, but it's actually the fact that the voice itself is welcoming, and it seems like you're in partnership with an athlete. But also think about just, how do you stand? How do you greet athletes? Are you approachable as a coach? Are you signaling things to the athletes that you enjoy and welcome the relationship with them? When you coach, are you miserable? Some of those things do have an impact on it. Well, I get a wee bit, I find it funny that there's a lot of coaches with pictures of themselves looking really serious and over concentrating, but again, just be conscious that while seriousness can communicate focus, you also want to ensure that you appear approachable, well focused. So there's some stuff in that, and it just depends on the moments and how you present yourself in different moments, I suppose, too. So there's a lot of things we're trying to keep in mind around standards, of performance. Sometimes a serious face helps towards the discipline required for upholding standards. So again, this isn't act like Coco the Clown, in terms of as a coach. That I don't think it needs to be that way. There's nuance within that, but definitely look approachable and have a warm communication style and the way that you say things and how you appear as you say them, and just look like you enjoy being with your athletes. It's like you sit down with people and you just don't get the vibe off them that they enjoy your company. It shows, and it really quite a deep level. It can really impact you. And look, I'm going to say something here as well. Consider in certain context how much you can never underestimate how much athletes look up to you and want to have a relationship with you. Children's coaches, I always say this, steal the spotlight a little bit into children's coaching. A wee boy or girl can think the world of you and you're not even aware of it, and actually their want for a relationship, if it's not reciprocated, can have a really bad effect. And this sort of leads a wee bit into, I suppose, one of the first parts about not just looking the part and looking like you want to spend time with athletes, but actually communicating and letting your actions say that you do and that you value them and that you care about them. Because the importance of unconditional regard towards a person is really, really key, because otherwise what coaches do in quite an insidious way is they actually wield the power of the athletes' want for a relationship with them, or maybe even wield the power of the athletes' want for a relationship with other people whose relationship is directly, or as in the case of maybe their teammates, or indirectly, as in the case of parents that are watching on from the side, tied to their involvement in the sport, and as a virtue of that, their involvement with you. A really, moany coach that one day is really moany because we've lost a game, to then really, really happy when we won a game. You create a pathology in an athlete there that can be quite disparaging and very extreme, and doesn't offer stability. And actually, and that's in some light, one little connection about stability of relationship is also a symptom, is also a feature of a stable, structured, competent, supportive environment. So we want athletes to get better, we want to challenge them, but if an athlete loses trust in the environment, they can't fully engage in practices that are challenging and helping them get better. So if, let's say, for example, as I say, in the way I communicate and how I approach athletes and deal with them is very conditional to how they've performed in a game. Athletes, in turn, will focus on winning and the outcomes that they feel matter for ensuring they can stabilise in a very sort of fruitless way the relationship with you. So all of a sudden they'll stop wanting to be vulnerable and they'll stop wanting to do challenging tasks, and they'll only focus on what's easy, what's dependable, and what ultimately gets them what they need. It leads to a lot of behaviours and sportsmanship and taking the easy route that just isn't good for them longer term. So that is really, really important. And that's why I'm going to put that as the very first action that I think you can take as a coach in terms of being related to supportive, not just in terms of how you're appearing, but what you actually say. Just make sure what you say and what you do match up, because I think it's very easy for coaches to talk about, it's not just about the result and don't worry about that, but then you look at them and their team sits 0 down, and I'm not saying coaches haven't got a right to be displeased about that, but we have to ensure that we don't, at least in the eyes of the athlete, conflate disappointment in their performance with disappointment with them and a person, and disappointment in a relationship with them, because that's something that we have to be very wary of, I think. And that's why I think even better, and that's why I just say, if you can't still show in a very overt way that you do care about that relationship and that's paramount and that can't be touched universally, then at very least you can mitigate maybe the required disappointment that you have to communicate to an athlete based on some sort of objective outcome, and signal the environment saying that's the result of a competition being one of the most obvious ones there. Then you can mitigate, against some of the damaging impacts of that if you ensure that you are separating the performance from the person. Okay. But yeah, if you can show that unconditional regard, that's great. And always talk to them the same way, always look after them the same way, even through challenging moments. That's what committed relationships do. They go through challenging times. And that is, there's caring elements that are required within that then, because it's not just about showing them that we still care. and that we're still okay, and that, you know, what happened isn't impacting how we are with each other. But we also need to actually care for. Care is an active, it's a proactive thing. So are you offering emotional support and care to your athletes? You know, how are you? Talk to me. What do you need? And this is where you can start to embed that into being autonomy supportive through care and through relatedness, because you're in some sense asking for the athletes and respecting the athletes' feelings and perspectives in a moment, and maybe even better carrying that, what they maybe say back to you, into what you do next, and therefore allowing them to have input and not feel like they're being moved around. So again, you're starting to see how important a caring approach to conversations that you have to show emotional support in for an athlete, for relatedness, how that has a real impact on autonomy again there. You have to ensure that your space is inclusive. And actually, sorry, what I do need to say here, and this sort of ties in with it as well, but you can't be all things to all people at all times. So, and the hardest part for a coach is, and this is obvious in a team context, because you're spinning plates all the time and relating the support for one athlete, particularly where there's intra-team rivalry and other things happening and occurring that sometimes you can avoid, but other times you just can't. You always have to be conscious that one signal you send to one athlete can be also interpreted as a signal sent to another. There's intentional action and consequence of action, and unintentional action and consequence of action. And I suppose all we can do as coaches is try and be as self-aware as we can be. But again, I think that comes to that. And I also say that in such a way that just to be mindful of the spread of that care that you show, and sensitive about how it's communicated to different ears, but also in terms of what emotional support and care can look like is also malleable, because again, people experience need satisfaction individually in some respects. So how it manifests, actually, your interpersonal involvement can be really communicated to an athlete if you treat them and support them in a way that's emotionally most effective for them. That's why I like the coach that shows tough love for one athlete and more sensitive, caring love for another. Not caring, more sensitive approach to care to another. That is equal relatedness support. That's not being harsher on another athlete for the sake of it. That's intentional, emotionally intelligent coaching. So, and I just say that so that, again, care doesn't need to be nice in the most overt way. Care doesn't even, and this again, on one side of the coin here, I could also suggest that care is about empathy. So that what I've essentially got coaches to try to get you to think about here is respect what athletes go through, acknowledge that, maybe actually overtly ask them how they're feeling, but you don't need to agree with it. You don't need to carry it forward. You might disagree with it, and you as a coach knows what they need. And this is in such a way that we can have functional empathy as a form of emotional support and care, as a form of relatedness, zooming out wider on it, because we can talk to an athlete, not agree with them, but help them feel understood, and by engaging in such a conversation and showing that you've put effort into doing that, make the relationship feel interpersonally involving for both parties. So, you know, all those things can come together. Again, it's not a caricature that you have to be, you know, nice all the time. It's just that you have to care, and what that looks like. And I think Colin Cronin's stuff is really interesting, where it starts to sometimes go into a bit of that, is dependent on the athlete, and actually just checking in on needs as well. As your care, your intended care, actually being received, is something also to consider. Having an inclusive space matters too. And I mean this insofar as ensuring that everyone who's under your charge feels like they do belong, and there are some overt practices that we can communicate that through. The most simple one is, you know, where maybe there's a disagreement, okay, or there's some sort of conflict. Sometimes we, as a solution to that, we send an athlete away, and you need to be careful about isolating athletes in that sense. But also we can consider, and it's not maybe out of a dispute, but out of circumstance. Injured athletes, for example, it's very easy for a coach to, right, just come back when you're feeling better. Okay, but that athlete still requires your support during it. So again, how are we working hard at a really good relating to supportive coaches, ensuring that athlete still has a role in the team? Checking up, are you coming to training? Come and help me out, watch things. Match day is another, and again, this is kind of where you're doing either kill two birds with one stone or hit an athlete with two stones. I'm not very good at that, but you kind of get my drift here. Institutions in a game day, particularly in a developmental context, let's say as a coach you say, do you know what, I don't care about the result, which means that I'm going to have, and I'm caring about your development here. Maybe if you're working in a youth context, I'm not necessarily going to encourage that not caring about the result is good in a youth context, but I think it can be helpful to some extent to focus on other things around mastery and self-development, and use the result as a a form of that. I won't get into that too much, okay? There's a form of checking in on that and how you're progressing. But let's say, if I'm really wanting to be related to supportive, I'm going to say, look, there's going to be subs today regardless. Everyone's getting equal game time. That is ensuring that we haven't isolated anyone and made anyone feel that they don't belong in the environment, because we have gave and ensured that the environment's inclusive. They've had equal opportunity to be there to experience what everyone else experiences, which communicates that they're the same as anyone else. Whereas, and it's also a way of signifying that you are showing unconditional regard to maybe the environment. The result, the storyline is trying to push you emotionally to start to be more selective with substitutions, where even though prior to the match starting you said you wouldn't be, but you've actually resisted that urge, and which is great. But think about the opposite we communicate too. So that's something that is quite important, just ensuring that the space that you create is inclusive. Now, try to also show care and concern for them. I know I've said that you can do that through actually engaging them in conversation, and I've already touched on that, but also just in terms of making your athlete feel like you're looking out for them. So what I mean by this, and it doesn't need to be something that's said to a group or said to the athlete directly, but a very common one that I see might be, imagine you turn up at a training session and there's wee groups of players talking, and then there's one kid or one player, senior player, kind of on their own. Now, you can just let other players know, just check in on John, or those sorts of things. Now, in that respect, John's maybe not directly feeling it through you. John's sense of relatedness and belonging in an environment is going to be indirectly satisfied through the fact that you've kind of used the athletes and the teammates to help do your job to the point you're sharing that there's a shared responsibility between the coach and also other players, particularly in a team context, to create a sensible one for everyone else that's also in that environment. That's why trying to really strengthen and bonds between teammates is really, really important. Or even if you're working in an individual sport, strengthen bonds within that athlete's circle is really important, because that's going to create a culture of care, which is wholly reliant on you, albeit you are coordinating activities. But then another form of showing you're looking out for an athlete can be, have you ever seen, so this is again maybe a wee bit more related to a kid's training session or whatever, where you just see acts of bullying perhaps happening, and you call it out and you let the player know that was maybe the target of that bullying, but through extension of calling out who were the bulliers. Stop that right now. We're going to have a word. That is not how we act. That sort of thing. You're showing an athlete that someone's looking out for them. That's not a great situation, in terms of recognising the wider team dynamics, and you'll probably need to do a bit of work there. But again, it's just an example of showing care and concern. And inside a competition, maybe an athlete gets injured. The first thing you should be thinking about as a coach from a caring perspective is going to that athlete, or, the referee's made a bad call, and this is a wee bit tricky, because I think coaches are trying, and the signals rightly so, is about ensuring that we communicate respect for referees, and that is by virtue of how we actually foster a respectful environment and respectful culture, is helping athletes understand how to respect other people. But where coaches can be caught up, and I think this is where coaches shouldn't be judged too harshly, is that inaction towards disrespect shown in your athlete is in some form an action towards, or is interpreted as an act of action against your athlete insofar as the relatedness they feel. This is why we need to think not just about avoiding actively frustrating behaviours insofar as relatedness in terms of actively being cold, actively shutting an athlete away from other people, but don't be neglectful. So don't be indifferent when things have occurred that have hurt your athlete or affected them in some way. Don't be in the act of passivity, being shown as choosing a side, or just, not treating an athlete's concerns or feelings as valid. That's a diminishing return, and over time that will seep into something more detrimental than what maybe appears right now in the day. Because impotency of actions also something to be considerate of. We can, over time, as I say, more in a neglectful manner, do behaviours that are either indifferent or just not doing enough to support relatedness. But then there are also some events where if you really get something wrong and you're really damaging towards an athlete, you're really socially negative towards an athlete, there's a wee bit of making up to be done there, and you might only have so long in order to do it before that feeling and the potency of that moment sticks. It can take many events for an athlete to lose faith and trust in an environment and turn off, but it could also take just one big event, and I think we need to kind of recognise that as well, the social element of coaching that's always at play there that we need to be mindful of. The last thing about being a relatedness supportive coach, and I suppose I sort of talked about this when I was talking about using athletes, teammates to help with things, but actually part of relatedness and part of belonging is that you give back to the community that you feel a part of. People want not just to feel cared for, but to have opportunities to care for others. So, and this is where I think the best way of working this into coaching is that you're developing competency, and still is psychosocial. Leadership is a skill. Being a teammate is a skill, and you can develop the skill of being a teammate while also satisfying the need for relatedness and the need for care, the need to care for the athlete. So are you actually offering opportunities for bonding and for athletes to do things for each other, to allow individuals to practice caring for other people, to be caring of other people, and to further then enrich the sense of well-being that they get from that through being charitable and being a good person, and doing it, again, contextually within an environment that they then really attach to who they are. If it gets to that point and they start to integrate it almost within their character, or at least they start to trust more and engage more because they see value in the environment for these other aims. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm at with that. Just insofar as getting across the need to be relatedness supportive as a coach. As I say, relatedness is also care. It's also functional relationships, whatever way you want to look at it. There's lots of other different frameworks to look at. As I say, Duet's sort of coach-athlete relationship stuff, Cronin's for caring coaching sort of stuff. But just please, if I can leave you with one thing here, there is a lot more to coaching, reminding you of that metaphor, than care, but care in itself is a big part of it. Remember as well, there's a lot of things that we associate as just being really, really important in coaching, but we, again, cause and effects never actually been proven in coaching, so we never actually know if anything is working. So why not think about what you can control best and most quickly today, which often is the lowest hanging fruit of just being a good person, and go and be a good person, and it will help your athlete. So yeah, I hope that has been useful to you guys. Please, again, let's continue the conversation. Comment, subscribe to the show, comment. Also find me on LinkedIn. I normally post about the show on LinkedIn as well. Connect with me, comment on the episode, tell me what you think, give me some feedback. Yeah, and reshare and pass on to other coaches, share the love a wee bit, share the information. Great, guys. I will see you next time.